Hi guys, here I'm going to show you how to perform advanced transposing in Excel. So what it's going to allow us to do is to take a big list like this and transpose every so many rows into a single row. So name, city, state becomes name, city, state. And we do this for the entire list over here. It's a pretty cool feature. It's much better than the regular transpose in Excel, which would just take the entire column and put it into a single row. However, we do have to use a macro for this. So what I'm going to do in this tutorial is show you how to use the macro, how to make your data go from this to this, how to change it to suit your data. Maybe you want to transpose not every 3 rows, but every 5 rows, and so on. How to change where you put the data in the worksheet. And then at the very end, I'll tell you all about the macro and how it works in case you're interested. Before we start, check the video description and click the link to TeachExcel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials. All right, so let me show you how the macro works. First, I'm going to go ahead and delete all of this data. Let's go ahead and clear all. So you may have noticed there were headings here. The headings aren't there by default. I just want to make it as clear as possible exactly what's going to happen here. So all we have to do is to select all of the data that we'd like to transpose, then hit Alt F8, go to our macro, hit run, and look there. How cool is that? That really does save you so much time. So then once you have this data, you can do whatever you want with it. I just put a little header up here. But later in the tutorial, I'll show you how you can move the data around so it doesn't appear next to this data within the macro, or do whatever you want with it. So that's really all there is to it. It's so cool. Now let me show you how to change the macro to work for your needs, because most likely your data set isn't going to be so simple. So let's go over here to example 2. Okay, so here we have, zoom in, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows that we'd like to transpose. All right, so to change this, we want to go to the VBA window, hit Alt F11, and then open up this module. So make sure you download the workbook so you don't have to copy, or so you don't have to write all this out by hand. Just copy paste it into your workbook. So when you download the workbook, open up module 1, go over here, transpose in rows, and here we are in the macro. To change how many rows you want to transpose, this is all you have to change. The 3 there and the 3 here. So these 2 things are what you have to change. So we want it to work on every 5 rows. So I'm going to change the 3 to a 5 and the 3 to a 5. And actually, now that I think about that, let's just make it like this. Step value, how about that? Equals 5. Should have done this before the tutorial, but that's okay. All right, so now I take that back. You only have to change it right here. So this would have been 3. Now let's make it 5. So this changes how many rows? To transpose. All right, now let's go back, Alt F11. First thing you have to do, select all of the data. So I'm going to hit Control Shift down, selects all of my data. Now Alt F8 to get the little macro window, run, and there we go. Name, contact, email, phone, address. Easy peasy. All right, now that you know how to do that, let's talk about changing where the data goes in the workbook. So right now it just goes to the very next column, and usually, if I'm honest, usually if you're taking data from this and putting it into this, it doesn't matter where it ends up over here because you have most likely imported all this data and it's on an otherwise empty spreadsheet. But maybe for one reason or another, you don't want it here to start in column B. So what we can do, go back to the VBA window, and all you have to do is change one little dude. So down here, let's open this up. I will add comments for each one of these lines later in the tutorial. But right here where it says offset, this is what controls where the data is going to end up. And right now, it is offset to 1 column to the right. If you wanted to change it to 2 columns to the right, you could do 2, or 3 columns to the right, you could do 3. And it's so many columns to the right of the data that you have selected. So if your data is in column 5 and you change this to 3, it'll end up 3 columns to the right of column 5. So let us go back, delete this, go down here, Alt F8, run the macro. See, we started here, 1 column, 2 column, 3 columns to the right. Now, if you want it to appear in a different row, go up here to Next Row and change the 1 to whatever you want. If you want it to appear in row 1, make that a 0. So, try it out. Delete the data. Go over here. Oops, sorry about that. Now it's in row 1. I like it when you do it in row 2 so you can easily put the headers here, name, contact, email, phone, address. Just makes life a little bit easier. I like it that way. But that's how you can change which row this data goes into and which column this data goes into. Now, one thing I want to show you, let's go back to example 1, is how to quickly combine the data. In another tutorial, I'll show you how to do this next step in the macro itself, but that's a little bit beyond this tutorial. So for now, let's just have the added step of combining the data. It is super simple. We just use concatenation. There are 2 ways to do this. Equals concatenate, and then you just select the cells you want to concatenate, and then select another cell. Go like this, and hit enter, and it concatenates the data. If you want a space in there, you just do quotation mark, space, quotation mark, comma, then you get a space. The way that most of us end up doing it, if you work with Excel a lot, is just to go like this though. Use the ampersand, then do your little space like that, then ampersand, next one, ampersand, next one. So you don't have to use the concatenate formula. Okay, what did I do wrong? Yeah. So I forgot 1 ampersand. That's very easy to do. And then copy it down, and now you have combined data. And of course, you can use whatever you want as a separator, a comma, space, put whatever you want inside the quotation marks. So I'm not going to cover that anymore in this tutorial, but that's sometimes or oftentimes, depending on your data set, the next logical step. So there's a very simple way to do it using a formula. And I'll devote an entire tutorial on how to make a really cool UDF or user-defined function or just regular VBA in a module to do this on its own. So it's pretty cool, but not here. Now what I want to do is go back to the macro and show you how to change it to make it a little bit more versatile or to do some other things. So here, let's go, I'm going to leave this guy here like this. Let's go over here. We shall delete all of this data. Let's go back to the VBA window, Alt F11. All right, let's leave, I want to put next row at 1. I like that because it's a good idea to put headers on your data after you transpose it. So let's figure out how many rows we want to transpose by using an input box. So let's prompt the user to tell us how many rows they want to transpose. It's very simple. All you have to do is type input box, and then quotation mark, how many rows should be grouped together, or say it in whichever way makes more sense to you. Now let's check it out. Alt F11. Now we select the entire data set. Alt F8, enter, and we get this awesome little pop-up window that's going to ask us how many rows we want to group together. So we put in 5, okay, and bam, that's it. How cool is that? Now let's go over here and test it out. I'm going to move this data out of the way. No problemo. Select the data we'd like to transpose. Alt F8, run the macro. How many rows should be grouped together? 3, okay. That is so cool. I love it. So that's one way to change your macro. Now, if the macro never, ever, ever needs to be changed, then you don't need to solicit input from the user. Just hard code it in like it was before, 3 or 5 or whatever you need. So now you've got a pretty cool, versatile macro. All right, I'm going to go ahead and delete this stuff and move these dudes back up here. Okay, go over here. Now let's do some more cool stuff. So you may have noticed that when we run the macro, let's go, okay, Alt F8, enter, 5, okay. So it does everything over here, cool, easy peasy. But we have this right here, and maybe you don't want that, and it can be kind of annoying. Maybe it could be confusing. If you have a long list, you won't even notice that it's there. The moment you hit escape, it's gone anyway. But let's go ahead and programmatically get rid of that. So basically, the macro's done, it's working. You don't need to watch anymore, really. The rest of this stuff is just going to be to make it look a little better, and then I'm going to add comments in here. I'll explain what each part of it is if you really want to know that, and then I'll explain a little thing for if you have a huge list, how to make it speed up, which I might actually do that right after this example because it's pretty important. So let's get rid of those annoying little things. Very simple. Application dot cut copy mode equals false. All right, select the data, Alt F8, 5, enter, good, good, and no little dots, no little blinking whatever the hell's for the selection, all gone. So really easy, really simple. Now let's go ahead and make it speed up a little bit. So you'll notice that you can see every line going in here is here, 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 and here. You can see that when I run the macro. So let's go back to the VBA window, go up here, and this is a tip I've mentioned many, many times. It's very helpful when working with large data sets in VBA. Application dot screen updating equals false. But at the end of the macro, make sure to turn that back on. Application dot screen updating equals true. And you could also turn off calculations or whatever you want. But usually when you do this kind of macro on this kind of data, there are no formulas or functions on the same worksheet. So now let's go back. I'm going to go ahead and delete this data this time. Select the data, 5. All right, and actually I want to make it so it's a little bit more visible, so let me redo that. All right, select the data, go up here. Now run the macro. 5. All right, I'm going to hit enter, and the data should just instantly all appear instead of seeing the selections go down row by row. Bam. Now, if you have a huge data set, that will actually save you, or it could save you, quite a bit of time. So I think I've covered all the things that you really need to do in the macro to make it work for your data set. If you want, you can go ahead and in the macro itself, you could hard code somewhere up here the titles for each column. That's pretty easy to do. You just reference the cell. So range A1 dot value equals whatever. So let's say C1 dot value equals my title, or just call it column header. And then just do that for as many cells as you want. So you can hard code it in that way. Super simple, easy way to do that. I'm not going to cover the myriad of different ways that you could have it go and automatically offset to the right or down or whatever. But if you're making a bigger macro, that's one way to do it. Now, let's go through the macro. Let's add some comments, and let's explain everything to you guys. So I'm going to do a little comment here. Make the macro run faster on large data sets. And then let's go ahead and do a complementary comment here. Make Excel function as expected after the macro is finished. When we're down here, let's go ahead and add a comment here. Remove the copy lines from the transposed data. or the transposed source data. Doesn't matter, whatever. You know what I'm talking about because I just covered it. So easy peasy. Now let's talk about how the macro works. It's pretty darn simple. So the first thing is do something with the user selected cells. So we want to know what row and what column to deal with. We want to know where the data is. And in this macro, we are setting it up so that you can select the data, and that data is what the macro is going to run on. Makes it a bit more versatile. So how we do that is we use the selection word. You've probably seen that if you've watched my other tutorials. It's great. It just pulls in all the cells that the user selected. So once we have the selection the user made, we want to figure out how many rows there are. So we do dot rows. Now we're dealing with the rows. What do we want to get from the rows? How many rows there are. So we do dot count. Now what do we want to do with this count of how many rows there are? Save it in the xRow variable. Now for the next line, let's figure out what column we're dealing with. Once again, we want to reference the cells the user selected, so we type selection, and just dot column, and that returns the column that we're dealing with. Now down here, I'll just add a quick comment here. I already covered that. Oh, I spelled range wrong. Range. Okay. Hard code column header example. And I'm going to comment this out so it doesn't mess up our macro. You can uncomment it and play with it as you'd like. All right, so now we have the number of rows and the column. I should probably call this X rows or X row count, something like that, probably a little bit more descriptive. You can change that as you'd like. But now what we want to do is we want to figure out the first row. So, or the next row. And maybe what I'll do is just take this and put it up above the hard-coded header example. So, next row. The row that the transposed data will be put into. So remember, if you change this to 0, the data will go into the first row first, and then down from there. Whatever you put it here, if I put it as a 1, the first row will be empty. It'll start in row 2. If I put it as a 2, it'll start in row 3, and so on. So this controls where the data will start, basically. Okay, so now I already covered the step value, how many rows to transpose. But let's talk about what actually happens. What does the transposing? Well, what we have here, it's a pretty cool little setup. We're going to loop through all the rows that the user selected, and we're going to do that using the count of the rows, and then we're going to use a variable here called I and set that equal to 1. And we're going to increment I on each iteration of the loop until we get up to the count of the total rows that were selected. In most loops, what you're going to see is that I, which is set to 1, would be incremented by 1 each time. So I would equal 1, then on the next loop it would equal 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then 5. But to make our life easier, we don't just increment it by 1 each time here, we increment it by a step value. So the step value, which we have set here in our input box, is how many rows we want to transpose at each time. So this will loop through I is equal to 1. Then we add the step value of, let's say, 5, and then it increases 1 by 5. So I now equals 6. And then it will go up by 5 on the next iteration of the loop, and the next iteration, and the next iteration. And this is actually the trick, or one of the tricks, that allows us to transpose every so many rows down the entire list. So for our note here, we're going to say loop through the user selected data using a step value. Now we go inside the loop, and what we have here first is to select the cells that we'd like to transpose. So what we do is we select the first cell that we would like to have in the transposition, and then we want to resize that by our step value. So our step value is 5. So what this means, the first time the loop runs, what this line is going to do right here is it's going to go to this cell right here, and it's going to copy down 5. So we have 5 rows selected, or it's going to copy down 4, so we have 5 rows selected. Then it's going to copy that data. So it copies it. The very next line is what takes the data from here, goes over here, and transposes the data. So this part right here, what we do here is we select a cell in the first row and the same column as our original selected data, and then we offset it. We offset it by our next row value, the next row value here, and then by how many columns we'd like to put it to the right. And then to transpose it, we use, there we go, paste special. So period paste special. Then we tell it what to do. Paste everything, then a comma, transpose true. So it's going to paste special transpose. This is the important part right here. So this line handles the transposing of the data. This line, let me go ahead and write that. Transpose the data. Copy the data using the step value to determine the size of the copied range. Transpose the data, and here we increment the next row value. So the copied data goes onto a new line. So the first time this loop runs, the next row variable will equal whatever we put here. Runs once, we increment it by 1 right here. So the next time the loop runs, this will be 1 higher. So the first time it runs, it'll be 1. It runs again, it'll be 2, then 3, then 4. That's what allows us to have the data appear here, then here, then here in separate rows so it doesn't overwrite. And that's all there is to this macro. I hope that you are able to learn how the macro works to better understand how to create macros for yourself, because that's why I explain these macros towards the end of the tutorials. I want you to know how the loop works for the most part and how every part of this macro works so that you have the tools you need to go ahead and change it for your workbook. But if you don't, feel free to ask, and I hope that I can be helpful, and I hope you found this tutorial helpful. I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.